Welcome to Kalam Podcast recording in Ramallah on the occupied West Bank in Palestine. We're sitting in Sirdab Studio and I'm honored to be introducing Abdaljawad Omar, a writer and a lecturer in philosophy at Bir Zeit University. Abdaljawad, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us today in Kalam Podcast.
Thank you for having me and offering me the space to speak.
Abdaljawad, you write a lot about Palestinian politics, and there's a lot of discourse and conversation around what happens after the kind of abyss genocidal moment we're in right now. But I think it would be very useful for a lot of listeners and viewers of Kalam podcast to understand the different Palestinian political factions that exist and what their role is and kind of what people think of them. So could you I know it's a big ask, but kind of like paint a kind of picture of the political forces in Palestine.
I mean, there's, first of all, an era of forces that we can speak of that have been historically constituted at different historical conjunctures, going back from the pre-1948 years when we had revolutionary subjectivities built around the subject of the peasant in the 1936 revolt.
Yeah, right.
And moving after 1948 into the Fida'i revolutionary subjectivity that rose with the PLO, and that was divided between a nationalist Palestinianism embodied in Fatah, which retained some secularism in its approach to politics, and other factions from the left, Arab nationalist left, like the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that were the primary force carrying the burden of attempting the notion or the big dream of liberation. However, these forces at some point or another, specifically after the Israelis entered in 1982 Lebanon, slowly started to erode, and their influence and legitimation within Palestinian society started to fracture.
Why is that?
For a lot of reasons. One of them is that the attempt for armed resistance as a strategy was not as successful as they thought it would be. The second is that they were exiled to Tunisia, 3,000 miles away from Palestine, where a revolutionary armed resistance liberation fixated on exile and attempting to return to Palestine would not be feasible. And the second element was that politics in Palestine started to have its center more within Palestine itself, historic Palestine itself. Doesn't mean that there's no politics before that within historic Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, and among Palestinian citizens of Israel. But what it meant is that you had this transformation, this gigantic shift from a politics that is centered on Palestinian refugees who were once peasants before 1948, become refugees, and then embody this Fida'i that we spoke about in exile. And then later on, we had, a politics that is more centered within Palestine itself, and it had its most, its most beautiful expression in the first Intifada, when the whole struggle was centered on civil disobedience, nonviolence, things like non-cooperation tactics, and that tectonic shift happened within Palestinian politics, and with it also the surgence of Islamist forces, specifically the Islamic Jihad and Hamas. And if we look at the Palestinian political scene, these are the primary forces, whether it's the PLO factions, the PFLP, the DFLP, or Fatah that we spoke about, or the Islamic revivalist groups, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and other, of course, configurations or political formations. Of course, this does not mean that we should exclude also from Palestinian politics, the politics of Palestinians in 1948, who have their own unique politics, but it's also could be at some level delineated through this kind of secularism versus Islamism delineation. However, what I would say in the past 30 years is central for people to understand, and specifically after the second Intifada, which started in 2000, ended somewhere around the 2005, is that Palestinian politics started to shift from this kind of Islamism versus secularism divide, or Shi'ism, into a divide between forces that see incorporation with Israel as a means to survival, and forces that see in resistance to Israel and the politics of defiance as a means to liberation. And in this context, Hamas and Islamic Jihad came to be the more energetic forces attempting this project of liberation through devising new strategies in terms of military means, etc., taking form specifically geographically in Gaza for historical reasons as well, because after the Second Intifada, Israel was capable of arresting or killing most of the resistance current within the West Bank, which meant that the bourgeois class within the PLO, people like Abu Mazen and others, could take control without fierce resistance from other oppositional groups, people like Marwan Barghouti or Abu Ali Mustafa, who was assassinated, or Ahmad Saadat, the head of the PFLP, who was arrested. They were neutralized, and you had only one faction taking control, and it was one that saw cooperation, and it manifested also geographically in the West Bank, while in Gaza, Hamas and Islamic Jihad were capable of taking over the Gaza Strip in terms of governance, and also entrenching their project for the military and armed resistance, and building its edifice, its tactics, its technologies, that opened the horizon of what we're now seeing in terms of the political possibilities emanating from October 7th.
I definitely want to get back into that divide that is that kind of holds Palestinian politics in a chokehold almost, I guess, and not just Palestinian. I think this kind of like cultural divide is a burden on many parts of the world, the West and the Arab world as well. But I just want to pick up on something that you said, which is just a historic fact that around in the late 80s, that is when we saw the kind of this non-violent, very innovative resistance that came out of the first Intifada, and at the very same time, the birth of popular revivalist Islamist politics. Is it too simplistic to say that these kind of trends are antitheses towards each other, or are they, and why did they emerge at the same time?
Well, I think no, they're not an antithesis to against each other. I mean, if we go back to the first Intifada in the 1980s, the late 1980s, we will see that all Palestinian forces, whether secular or Islamist, engage in non-cooperation tactics. And this is, I think, one of the fundamental elements that people should grasp, is that the choice between violence and non-violence is not really a choice. It emanates from a material necessity.
Right.
So in the first Intifada, the idea of non-cooperation worked. Israel held the towns like Ramallah, where we're sitting. The soldiers were inside the towns. So if you decide as a revolutionary political force to do a strike, you're challenging directly, for instance, in this case, the military authority of the Israeli government. And that means that you have the ability to create these forms of civil disobedience, creating autonomous collectives. The first Intifada was full of people attempting, educational collectives, trying to create agricultural cooperatives, attempting to create these kind of autonomous institutions where Palestinians can express themselves and their identity without the interference of Israelis. And that at that particular moment, that was the struggle. That was the front lines of the struggle, and you were capable of doing that. However, as we move towards what has been termed the Oslo process, what happened specifically was a spatial reconfiguration of arrangements. The Israelis withdrew from towns. They permitted the rise of something like the Palestinian Authority, which was this autonomous or semi-autonomous authority that will take care of civil issues, educational issues, health issues, relieve the Israelis from the responsibility towards the occupied population. And that means that things like autonomous and collective educational initiatives lost their meaning as a tactical element. But the occupation retained its presence, the settlements retained their expansion. So Palestinians still had to fight through the persistence of colonialism. And in that moment, in the mid-90s, they started to reconfigure their, actions towards more offensive actions, military actions, actions that could actually fracture this kind of frontier warfare that was unfolding. Whether, in places like, if we, take a car ride 5 minutes from here, and we go to the area of North Al-Bira city, what is called popularly the DCO area. That's where usually clashes happen. You have these frontier clashes between Israeli soldiers who snipe protesters, Palestinian protesters, and Palestinians who are attempting to protest. And that tells you also another story that was unfolding as we move deeper into the first Intifada and the Oslo process, that Israel intensified its violence against the Palestinians, having failed to actually control them. So with the intensification of violence, also Palestinians were, searching for violent means to defend themselves. So it's important at least to situate that there's not really necessarily a problem that, our choice or the choice for Palestinians between violence and nonviolence, whether Islamists or seculars or, whatever ideological inclination people have, it stems from the material necessity. Resistance as a solution to a predicament. And for Palestinians, it arises from the concrete material situation that we find ourselves in. So I wouldn't frame it as, Islamist revivalist forces are the ones that took the Palestinian struggle toward, a more violent armed struggle.
That's not necessarily what I was thinking. I just purely ideologically. I mean, much of the first Intifada was led by women. By women who took a big space in the public sphere, violent or non-violent. It seems maybe, and this may be like a Western mind thinking, but it seems that these two, it's interesting why these two ideologies or trends emerged at the same time.
Because now you're pointing to something else, which I think is how the relationship between men and women are arranged within the secular space versus the Islamist space. And it's important here also to note that it's not necessarily that Hamas and Islamic Jihad don't fold women as active agents within their groups.
No.
So, but the arrangement is different. They have and they have a different element. And I would say, historically speaking, there are moments in the history for Hamas, for instance, if it was not for the women in Hamas would cease to exist.
Sure, yeah.
They carried the burden of organizing, of student activism, etc. But they were not in the forefront, at least in public eye. I mean, that was a primary difference with the secular space that was more comfortable in placing women in much more advanced roles in the public eye. And we can, talk about that more. However, what happened was more around, let's say, the leftist secular space itself, because it went with the Oslo project. It bought into it, whether it's the left, the PFLP and DFLP, who would now, situate themselves as this kind of pliant opposition to the Fatah, who were the more hegemonic force at that particular moment, who were constructing, the Palestinian Authority itself. Or it was Fatah itself who decided to transfer its revolutionary zeal into this kind of governance entity that would attempt this negotiating peace process with the Israelis that we all know has ultimately failed. So it was the secular space that chose different types of politics, one premised or predicated on cooperation with the Israelis, whether it's security, civil, economic, etc. And that allowed for this kind of younger force, the Islamist force, to emerge as seen as the bearer of the hope for Palestinian liberation.
Right.
And what they did is that they learned the lessons of the PLO. Does negotiation lead to an outcome? They said to themselves, no. They looked at the PLO experience in terms of how they arranged their military strategy and said the PLO, one of the problems it had in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, it never took the military side of things very seriously. And, Hamas and Islamic Jihad were more or organized and centralized their efforts around building, new technologies, tactics that would, prove somewhat effective in terms of allowing the capacity of resistance of Palestinians to remain through time, but also taking, this kind of dialectical approach with Israel in terms of trying to penetrate armored vehicles or building a subterranean, as we saw in Gaza, subterranean city underneath Gaza, or creating from Israeli debris and bombs that were left unscathed after they were bombed, new bombs that would actually target the Islamic military. And it comes also, and this is where perhaps there is some sort of ideological inclination, and it's the fact that a lot of the Islamists are more interested in engineering and science and technology,
Right.
rather than social ideology and
Yeah,
spreading it.
sure.
Although that's also part of their program,
Mm.
but that is the emphasis they place is on science and technology and engineering, and in that realm, they were also learning the lessons of the PLO, and of course they benefited from this kind of Islamic revivalist tendency within the region, embodied in the revolution in Iran in 1978 and moving forward.
You've written about the many times Western, but not only, also Arab sort of uncomfortability with the Palestinian armed resistance, because it's not coming from the progressive left or any kind of secular force. It's coming from an Islamist revivalist movement mainly. And I don't know if you would frame it as such or if it's a hard truth, but if you would want to support armed Palestinian resistance mainly today, there's not really a viable option in terms of if you want to support like a progressive force as the PFLP, you know.
I mean, there is. I mean, we should remember in Gaza there are, the multitude of Palestinian forces that we just spoke about are resisting. I mean, Hamas is the primary force in the Gaza Strip, but it doesn't mean that there's not a whole, the PFLP, the DFLP, even parts of Fatah, and of course the Islamic Jihad and others are engaged in the armed struggle in the Gaza Strip. So resistance is not confined to a specific ideological cohort. And I think that's why in Palestinian society, resistance is not something that is very disagreeable, although it's becoming more so. And not necessarily for resistance itself, but for the repercussions of resistance in relation to Israel, and how it deals with attempts and moments where Palestinians rupture their regime of terror that we live under. But to your question, what I would say is that the very nexus of resistance with Islamist forces at this particular moment is just a historical contingency. And tomorrow it could be another force with another ideology. Now, the uncomfort, I don't think has to do with the Islamic revivalist element. I think it was always an uncomfort with Palestinian resistance more broadly, specifically when it takes forms of, armed resistance. In the 1970s and 80s, Fatah, the PFLP, the DFLP, they were all also branded by many in the Western left, terrorist organizations, pirates of planes. They were looked at with a lot of animosity from a lot of parts of the Western left. Even philosophers like Sartre and others who supported the anti-colonial resistance in Algeria, when it came to Palestine, they couldn't really broach the topic for a lot of reasons. Some of it has to do with the history of anti-Semitism in Europe. Some of it has to do with the Holocaust and
it's mainly that, isn't it?
Somewhat. I mean, there is that level to it. Yeah, I mean, at least in the left, that there's that kind of relationship of also attempting to equalize between, Palestinian indigeneity and Jewish indigeneity, and looking at Ashkenazi Jews as indigenous to Palestine, and trying as much as possible to legitimate, this Zionist enterprise that has been built on our expense. So there is that kind of Western inclination, and which meant that many in the West and in the progressive left has always found Palestinian fighting back as something to despise or to fight against and push back against. And of course, we should, the mainstream media and, the liberal center in the West has always been anti-agnostic towards Palestinian resistance more broadly. And I think part of what I'm trying to say to people is that resistance just comes out of, a material necessity, a predicament. We live under a regime of terror. It chooses when to arrest people and when not to arrest people, who to kill and who not to kill. And even when we take, depoliticized subjectivities, we don't care about, politics. It's because there's this history of long trauma, where our parents were imprisoned, our children might be imprisoned, tortured, killed. So living under that type of regime of terror, people will try to find solutions. And one of the solutions that they will attempt is resistance by any means necessary.
Yeah. You've written about when you mentioned earlier you speaking about snipers. And you've written about your own. I mean, you were a victim of an Israeli sniper, um, and you wrote about this kind of strange dynamic of dehumanization and sort of depersonalization. I mean, obviously, being dehumanized by someone shooting you without with complete disregard for who you are, who what your name might be, or whatever human attributes you might have. But then the kind of reaction as well from the people who on the Palestinian side who helped you, who kind of saved you, and notions of don't take it personally, or it's not about you, or something like that. What is it to be sort of an individual or a human in this situation?
I mean, it's difficult because at some level, if we think about our lives here, we are a field of targets, and now
Yeah.
we're seeing it unfold in Gaza. No, like there's been these revelations about AI technology being used to classify people and targets, and to choose which types of bombs to drop on people's homes and how many people should be killed or not killed. So you have in a very, at the core of it, you have this military machine, a superior Western military machine that can choose at any time to unleash its wrath. And whether it's the sniper or it's the pilot in a cockpit in an F-16 or F-35, or whether it's an Israeli soldier behind a tank, these machines are meant at the end of the day to kill and maim and disrupt our lives, and to maintain us in this kind of subjected condition where we don't have our rights to self-determination, liberty to live in dignity, and without the control and mastery of somebody over us. And it manifests sometimes. I mean, I think for me, part of the irony of being hit by a sniper, it was in my ankle. It wasn't a dangerous hit or anything like that. So a lot of my friends, were making fun of me. And as you know, because you visited Palestine a lot, we've normalized a lot of things, and the way we deal with them is we actually crack jokes about them instead of
Black humor.
take them seriously or dramatically. But yeah, there is, at the end of the day, there's this kind of face that looks at you as something that can be easily killed.
Yeah.
And not only that, as something that once they hit you, they take pleasure. And that's what we've been seeing, this kind of form of obscene
Yeah.
genocide taking
Yeah.
place. It's not only just killing and feeling a shame about killing. No, it's a shameless form of genocide where there's a festive element to it. Soldiers within Gaza, celebrating, destroying homes and universities and hospitals, killing people up close or from a distance. So that kind of obscene form of you can see it in their eyes. I could see it when I was hit. I think a lot of Palestinians can see it when they're arrested and being, brutally beaten by Israeli soldiers. But that used to happen behind closed doors,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
cells, and now it's out in the open, and everybody in the world can
On
see
TikTok.
it. Yeah, it's on TikTok. They're shameless about it, and I think that's also a form of power. It's like looking
Yeah.
at the world and saying, we can do this, and we can celebrate doing this
With impunity.
with impunity, and you can do nothing about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do Palestinians have the right to mourn? Or maybe if I phrase it, do you think the rest of the world thinks that Palestinians have the right to mourn?
Well, I mean, I wrote a piece, and I think you're referencing that, which is "Can the Palestinian Mourn?" And it was I was provoked to write it after I read an article by Judith Butler,
Mm-hmm.
a famous philosopher and social theorist who I think teaches at Berkeley.
Yeah.
And I think what prompted me to talk about it was this idea that, what form of, if it's even possible for Palestinian to mourn them. And there's two elements for me in that. The first is that we're denied the right to mourn because the killing is always, recurring.
Yeah.
So you lose somebody, but you can always lose somebody else. So there's this kind of recurrent pulsion of loss in our lives. And we're now seeing it intensify in magnitude that we haven't seen, at least historically. There's no case like this before in the Gaza Strip, but it remains also present in the West Bank and other places across historic Palestine. And that kind of recurrence of loss, does not offer you this chronal refuge where you can sit behind a closed door in your home and actually do the process of mourning and coming out from it, trying to detach from the object of loss, whether it's an idea or a person or anything of that sort. The second element of it is that Palestine also refused to mourn. Because mourning, at least in psychoanalytical theory, has this kind of core to it that Freud spoke about, which is at the end you want to detach. So what it would mean to mourn Palestine? To mourn Palestine, it means to detach from it. No.
Yeah.
So there's an element also of we as Palestinians also refuse to go or commence this process of mourning. And instead, we get these two forms of melancholy, which is a bit different than mourning, which is, you're still attached to the object of loss. You don't let it go. And there's two forms, I think, now, which actually harken back to our discussion on, Fatah and Hamas, for instance, cooperation and resistance.
Yeah.
The first process of melancholization is that you return Palestine as this kind of shattered spectral image that you fight through resistance to retain. So you can only commence the process of mourning after liberation. And in a lot of Palestinian literature, whether it's in Mahmoud Darwish's poetry or Ibrahim Nasrallah and others, you can see a lot of that happening in terms of, awaiting this moment where we can actually cry, the cries that are not defiant against the gaze of the settler or the soldier. And at the same time, you have another process of melancholization, which I think that is important and fundamental, which is that, you retain this kind of spectral image of Palestine. You put a flag on it, you put a ministry on it. But at the same time, in essence, you're betraying the idea of Palestine. And I think, for me at least, I see the Palestinian Authority as embodying this attempt to betray Palestine in the name of Palestine.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your time, Abdaljawad Omar, a writer and a lecturer of philosophy at Bir Zeit University. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today at Kalam.
Thank you, Habibi.
Thanks.